We negate resolve. On balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. Contention 1 is aggression. Sergei Alexishenko of the Center on Global Interests finds that the main goal of sanctions was to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine. Instead, Russia paid no attention to the sanctions and annexed Crimea, unleashed an armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, transformed Donetsk and Luhansk into a territorial entity independent of Kiev, and expanded the territory under the separatist control. Sanctions have not only failed to stop Russian belligerence, they've also made the problem worse in two ways. And the first is by backing Russia into a corner. Sanctions are contributing significantly to Russia's economic woes. Bokani and PBS writes in 2015 that because of sanctions, no financial institutions have dared to provide Russia with any financing. As a result of financial sanctions, Russia cannot mitigate the blow of its oil market collapse by borrowing money. In addition to losing a safety net, Daniel Dresner also finds that in 2014, more than $150 billion in private sector capital left Russia so as to avoid the prospect of financial sanctions. As Anna Borshenkaya of the Washington Institute in 2015 explains, Russia's dire economic state only fuels Putin aggression. Indeed, the weaker Russia gets, the more dangerous it becomes. The Economist furthers that Russians value two qualities, wealth and military strength. The less Putin can provide of the former at home, the more he must demonstrate the latter abroad. This is already manifesting in two ways. First, Olivia Ward of Star reports that Russia's military action in Syria is a ploy to ease Western sanctions that punish Moscow for its incursions into Ukraine. Second is by fueling confrontation with the West. Jurgens of the National Interest in 2014 explains that sanctions contribute to the Putin-driven soft nationalization of the elites. Frank Maxwell of New Europe in 2014 explains that the EU's flurry of economic sanctions have given the Russian president a new opportunity to boost up patriotism by using a nationalistic rhetoric to criticize economic restrictions. Sanctions allow Putin to paint himself and Russia as the victim. Kumbo from the Center for a New American Security in 2014 explains that having been attacked by a number of European powers throughout history, Russians are uniquely sensitive to any actions that would supposedly seek to limit or infringe upon Russian notions of sovereignty. Overall, sanctions are escalating tensions on all fronts between Russia and the West, leading to a much higher chance of conflict. Empirically, David Letskian of Texas A&M University finds that sanctions increases the probability of militarized conflict by 17%. Any increase in probability of conflict is extremely dangerous, as the situation status quo borders on chaos. Larissa Brown of the Daily Mail finds that Vladimir Putin is actively preparing for war in Europe. Contention 2 is human rights. There are three reasons why human rights abuses increase after sanctions. First, East Carolina University reports that to target leadership can use the economic disruption as a strategic tool to manipulate access to and redistribute resources made scarce by sanctions to enhance its authority and subsequently weaken opposition groups. Second, Hexon explains that the targeted leadership usually perceives the foreign pressure as a threat to sovereignty and particularly to regime survival. Leadership is likely to surmise that conceding to the foreign pressure will decrease their legitimacy and support within a country. Hence, external economic pressure gives another excuse to employ repression. Third, Paxson furthers that sanctions are also exploited by the target leadership to broaden their legitimacy and to justify repression against anti-regime groups because leaders often depict economic sanctions as an external threat to national unity. For these three reasons, Paxson concludes that frequent violations of human rights become 29% more likely under partial sanctions. Human rights violations oftentimes manifest themselves in interstate conflict. According to David Sobek of LSU in 2005, movement from the lowest to the highest amount of respect for human rights decreases the probability of interstate conflict by 88%. Because of these reasons, Harrison and I are proud to negate.
We'll see this. This is some stuff. I want to have full of Sobek.
good level for everyone? All right, let's begin. Because Putin's been naughty, but instead of getting coal, he's getting sanctions, Charles and I affirm. Contention 1, ghost of sanctions passed. Sanctions have been so effective over the past 2 years that they have limited Russia's capacity to act offensively. This is true for 2 reasons. First, their economy is weaker now. Anders Aslan, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, finds that the Russian economy is now in a serious financial crisis with an estimated 10% decrease in GDP this year, with one of the major causes being sanctions, and that no one is willing to provide Russia with financing due to fear of American regulators. This is critical because Sarah Krebs from Cornell University finds that modern wars are financed entirely through borrowing. Russia can't receive loans and is in the midst of a financial crisis, so there's no way they can afford to carry on war. Even more so, Russian economists are suggesting that as a result of decreased economic strength, deep military budget cuts will be enacted next fiscal quarter. Second, the arms embargo. As Simon Wiesman of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute explains, Russia's military strength has been historically dependent on its ability to export weapons to foreign partners. Matthew Bodner of the Moscow Times reports that the real impact of the EU arms embargo will be felt in Russia's $646 billion military modernization drive through 2020, which relies solely on high-tech foreign counterparts with no domestic analogs. The decrease in armed power is why Russia has agreed to negotiate. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told reporters in Berlin that a final ceasefire was 90% ready and that they were just working out the details. As a result, Ukrainian Defense Minister Stepan Poltorak said fighting has fallen to its lowest level since the conflict began. This decrease in Russian offense becomes imperative when the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff reveals that the Russian expansion poses the largest threat to the United States. Contention 2, ghost of sanctions present. Currently, we see Russia as shifting their focus to the domestic front. Sergei Girov in the Journal of Economic Perspective finds that 10 key families, or oligarchs, control over 60% of the Russian stock market. He further finds that these oligarchs have extreme political power in Russia, including in Russia's foreign policy. The first round of sanctions was designed to target Putin's oligarch allies. This is why Robert Frank, CNBC wealth journalist, found that several of Putin's elites had lost billions due to sanctions and have been forced to turn over assets after sanctions were implemented. This is critical. Mark Galliotti, professor at NYU Center for Global Affairs, sees the most likely way Putin to lose power was how his predecessor lost power. A consensus emerges among Russia's elites that he is not the best man to run the country. Galliotti elaborates, there is another risk to Putin's control through opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who could make a powerful argument that Russia's people are being bled and exploited given current circumstances. He specifically sees 2016 as quote-unquote crunch time, where Putin risks losing his power. Threat is therefore being reduced for 2 reasons. First, less ability to use oligarchs to lobby means that foreign interventions are difficult to initiate. Second, Putin must focus on getting sanctions removed or risk losing power, either by the oligarchs or by popular revolt. Our third and final contention is ghost of sanctions future. Moving forward, Russia will be thinking differently about military action because international law's legitimacy has been reinforced. Robert Voltaire, a London-based practitioner in public international law, explains, on multiple levels, Russia has now transgressed international law, and its only pretext for annexing Crimea is based on the recognition of a referendum which has no legitimacy in international law. Professor Schauer from the University of Virginia explains that sanctions are a critical component of meaningful laws. Quoting legal philosopher John Austin, he explains without sanctions, commands would really be no more than requests, and it is the threat of sanctions which provides the law with its authority. Furthermore, consider after Russia's de facto annexation of South Ossetia in 2008, it did not receive sanctions and continued on in the same manner with the 2014 annexation of Crimea. This means sanctions are important not just for weakening Russia, but also for maintaining the international norm against illegitimate annexations. Peter Harold for the Center of New American Security finds the impact on Russia is not only the measure of whether it has succeeded, even more so, the West has a profound interest in signaling that the use of force to change borders is unacceptable. The very real cost that sanctions have imposed on Russia will serve as a deterrent in the future, which is corroborated by the UN Sanctions Study Group. Thus, we affirm.
So, on your first contention, subpoint B about arms embargo, you say that Russian strength is dependent on exports. Why is that?
because they are known for being a military-producing powerhouse, and so they don't really need to import a lot of weapons. Rather, they make a lot of their money on exporting weapons, which is then reinvested into their military.
Wait. But if at the end of the day, them exporting less weapons means that they have more for their military, isn't that probably not a great thing for Russian aggression?
Yeah, the problem is they're not exporting so much that there's like a deficiency of weapons. Instead, what happens is when you put on the embargo...
Wait, deficiency of weapons? You just said that they have an excess of weapons.
I think you're just kind of like picking and choosing from like 3 or 4 words in my sentence.
No, I'm asking you to pick and choose from what you're running.
Yeah, it's arms embargoes. I thought that was kind of clear.
No. Okay, but the warrant, you say that Russian military strength is dependent on exports.
Yeah,
you say,
so,
first of all, it's deficient, and then you say we have an excess of Russian arms in Russia.
Let me try to put it into like real terms. I think you're having like a hard time grasping the concept. Say every year Russia makes 100 assault rifles. Their military only needs 50 of those, and without embargoes, they would then send off the other 50 to the West. What happens is when you put embargoes on them, now they have these 50 that they would have been selling that they are now not selling.
So those 50 are now just sitting in the coffers doing nothing.
Precisely, yeah. Now can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So what exactly is happening with this increase of conflict? Like, why do we see this happening in the real world?
Why?
Yeah.
Because as Russian economic strength decreases, Putin feels the need to power project abroad.
All right, do you have a question for me?
Yeah, sure. So, in your discussion of oligarchs, why your impact is that foreign interventions become more difficult. There is literally 0 cards or 0 warrants for that, so can you please explain them?
Yeah, we'll drop it. The real impact is that Putin risks losing power, which is why he has to start focusing domestically.
How do you know that the loss of his power is going to be good for Western interest?
It's not that's like not the point that the contention's making. What we are telling you is from Galeotti of NYU, in which he tells you Putin's risking losing power the same way his predecessor lost power, that the richest people in Russia came to the consensus that he wasn't the best man to run the country.
Putin losing power is not necessarily a good thing for Western interest, so I'm asking you, how do you know that it will be?
And I'm getting to that. What the problem is that right now, Putin's acting as an expansionist in which he's looking outside of his borders. The problem is when sanctions are harming the oligarchs, and the oligarchs are so responsive for a large majority of his politics and his stock market, he has to care about them. And insofar as they're posing a direct threat to his power, he has to stop his expansion and instead look to the domestic front to change his policies to help the oligarchs so he doesn't lose power.
That's still not an answer to my question of why the leader after Putin is going to be good for Western interest.
That was never a question, and we don't have to show you that. What we do show you is that a direct result of sanctions is that he stops expanding and starts looking domestically.
So your warrant is just based on a threat of him being pushed out of power, not on him actually being pushed out?
Not a threat. It's happened in the past.
Wait, so there's my question. How do you know after Putin leaves, it will be better? That was the original question.
That's not our burden to show you.
No, definitely is. Okay, we'll take some prep time, please. All right, you dropped him first. was 243. Kyle, is that what you have? 243? 245?
Do you need to see that before our vote?
I thought I would look at it first, but I can see that.
Because, I mean, his computer is notoriously.
Okay, I can see that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Opponents, partner, all of my 17 plus judges. Let's start off with my opponent's first contention on military capability. First of all, they don't actually prove to you at the end of the day that they degrade Russia's military capacity to the point where they will no longer be able to engage in military action except through this lone argument, which I'll get to later. Ultimately, global firepower finds that Russia is the number 2 ranked military in the world. They don't even show you at the end of the day that they're going to bring that down to 3rd, to 4th, to 5th, even 10th. At the end of the day, they still have plenty of capacity to invade countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Syria, which have third world infrastructure and not a lot of resistance to the Russia's military. But let's go into their specific warrants. First, they tell you essentially that Russia's losing loans, but essentially they give you they give you no warrant for why loans are necessary to finance wars. They literally just make this claim. That's why you drop this warrant. But secondly, Vice News explains that Russia has recently signed deals with China to access loans there if they truly need it to finance war. At the end of the day, they don't actually prove a decrease in aggression. Then they tell you essentially that Putin's modernization plan is going to be effective because he's lacking high-tech exports, but actually what the Guardian finds is that Putin's modernization plan is still underway for $22 trillion. Logically, what he does is he just promotes his domestic industry, well, essentially to create all the high technology that serves his needs. They don't actually prove to you that the West is the only people on the planet with the capability to provide this technology, de-link them there. Let's go into their second contention where they talk about oligarchs. A lot of problems with this. First, on face, Karen Dewisha of the World Affairs Journal explains the political leaders and oligarchs today in Russia came to their status of wealth and prestige through sticking by Putin. Even if his policies are causing a decrease in their wealth right now, they won't bite the hand that feeds them. But secondly, you can turn this against them with the Jurgens evidence we read in case. As sanctions target these oligarchs and their sources of wealth, they become increasingly reliant on the wealth provided by this state, which Putin himself controls. Jurgens finds that the state can more than make up for this wealth, which proves that sanctions only entrench the oligarchs under Putin's foot, only makes them more dependent, turn this against them, they're decreasing democracy in Russia. But finally, sanctions give Putin political cover and radicalize the population by increasing anti-Western sentiment. That's from Alui Abdelmalek of Forbes, who finds that sanctions have empirically never led to regime change because ultimately they're always twisted against the sanctioner by the local population. Their only impact, because they dropped their other one in crossfire, is essentially that Putin's going to get ousted. But the problem with this is explained to you that by the Moscow Times, who says that even if Putin was going to be ousted, all of Russian oligarchs and all of the people in charge want somebody like Putin with those same qualities. In other words, they still want a system of Putinism. It would just be without Putin. At the end of the day, if they install a similar leader, that person is likely to have similar political preferences to Putin in the long term. They don't actually prove to you that they're reaching any impact from changing the leader, even if you grant them their impact. Now let's go to their third point on international law. A couple problems here. First, Alfred McCoy of The Nation explains that the United States regularly itself ignores international law, which undermines its credibility overall. They don't actually prove to you at the end of the day that sanctions can rebuild all the damage that's been done to international law in the history of international law. Insofar as the West violates it itself, there is literally no impact of providing sanctions. But secondly, Letzkian of Texas A&M finds that sanctions are interpreted as a sign of weakness because they signal a lack of willingness to commit to either firm military or firm diplomatic options. That's why empirically, Gibson of Texas A&M University finds that the successive sanctions dropped by 7% for every 10 years. At the end of the day, they don't show you any critical impacts of this contention. You're going to vote for the negative off of it. But fourth, finally, remember, you can cross-apply the Letzkian analysis that we give you at the top of our case, which tells you that there's a 17% increase in conflict when you oppose sanctions. The reason why this is because essentially the way Putin works is not how international law works. The way Putin works is when economic strength decreases in his country, the only way he knows how to make up for that is through projecting his military strength abroad. Insofar as that's true, they're not applying this contention well to Russia. We're the only ones doing that in the round.
Okay, now the round?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
So it's basically discussed in the entire article.
Okay, as long as you don't point me to like a specific part. That's it.
That's from
Let's do that basic question. I think it's like, it's gonna show me that it's gonna be 70%.
yeah. I mean,
I have it up right here.
no, I have it cut on my piece. I think you're looking like I'm not making notes. I don't know what you're.
We just don't know.
Yeah.
We believe it.
Yeah, I'm
I don't know if you're looking at this.
So we're not running separate. Okay, here's the context.
awesome.
Are you guys going to continue, Brad?
All right. Opponents ready? Sam?
Yeah.
Is anybody not ready?
We'll take like 10 seconds. I'm not sure.
Okay, a little bit more. I assume everybody's still ready. Start off in their first contention, which talks about deterring Russian aggression. Their first evidence here talks from Eloshenko, says that they're continuing with aggression. The really big issue with this is they don't show if that aggression is actually continued post-sanction, make them like give you these specific instances about like Kiev and stuff, and make them show you that it was because of sanctions and after sanctions. We go to the first warrant here, which talks about backing Russia into the corner. There's one really big issue with this warrant as a whole, that they're showing you the intent of Russia without showing you the actual capability of Russia to carry out those intents. And that's really important because the Wagner evidence we read you in case shows that they cannot modernize their military insofar as they're not able to import the Western military tech, then they need to modernize their military. Therefore, they're not able to expand further west because that would inevitably result in a confrontation with the West, which they can't sustain because they don't have modern military technology. The second issue with this is that it's not sustainable. You can look at Franz Gatti of The Diplomat, finds that in 2015 there was a really high increase in military spending, but in 2016 it was only a 0.8% increase in military spending. That's still an increase, but the issue is it shows that the amount of spending he's doing isn't sustainable, and in the long term he's not going to be able to continue financing the war at the same rate. So even if there might be like a short-term increase in the amount of backlash, that's significantly outweighed because in the long term he's not able to sustain his war going into the future. And that's confirmed by the Krebs evidence we read you in case, which shows you that modern wars are financed via borrowing consequently because he can't borrow from the West, and they never show you they're getting enough money from China. That means they're not going to be able to sustain that war going into the long run, and it's already confirmed because he's already had to make such drastic cuts to his military budget. The second issue with this, their entire warrant here is that their economy has stopped growing and it's currently in a decline. That's really important because the prerequisite to sustained warfare is to have a strong economy, and so far as they concede in this contention that there is a weakening economy, that's a really easy reason to vote affirmative. Move on to the next thing, which talks about Syria. There's two issues here. The first is that because of sanctions, we now have more leverage over Russia. You can look to Dina Gazovsky of CNBC, who says that it gives the West leverage over Russia because Russia, once those sanctions lifted, consequently try to foster a sense of goodwill between the West and Russia, between the West and Russia. Therefore, they're more likely to cooperate with Syria, and that's confirmed by the CNN article from 2 days ago, which says that Russia signed a UN resolution in order to broker a peace deal in Syria. That's important because it shows that they're changing their intentions in the Syria in a way that would not happen absent sanctions. Now move on to where they talk about how it's doing confrontation. The warrant here is that there's an increased level of nationalism. Two really big issues with this on face. First comes from Simon Galford of National Interest, who finds that only 33% of Russian citizens actually blame the falling economy on the sanctions. What that means is they're not showing you this uniquely passes the threshold into where they become so nationalistic that they engage in military action, make them show you that will actually happen. The second issue is that the support for government overall is going down. You can look to Robert Ledgold of National Interest magazine, who finds that since June it went down to 55%. That's a 9% decrease. That's really important because even if support for Putin specifically is going up. It's just the overall support for the Russian government is going down, meaning nationalism is going down too. And then the third issue, they give you this Letskin evidence saying it's increasing the probability of military conflict. The issue with that is that it says in the conclusion that if the sender incurs a high cost to himself, that reduces the chance of conflict. We think that because the sanctions were costly to the EU and the counter-sanctions were also costly to the EU, that reduces the risk of conflict. That's a turn on their evidence. Then they give you this Brown evidence saying that Putin is preparing for war. This is from August. It's post-dated by the Polsharok evidence. We read you in our case, which shows that the fighting's at its lowest level. Even if he was preparing in August, it shows that it was never actually actualized. There's no reason to believe it will be actualized in the future. None of their second contention, which talks about human rights. There's four main issues here. The first is that none of the evidence they give you in this contention is specific to Russia in any way whatsoever. It's a bunch of overvague, overbroad studies which say that human rights might go up. They don't give you any actual quantified examples from Russia. There's no way to weigh this in actuality. The second issue with this is they don't show you the actual threat to Western interest. The U.S. Joint Chief of Staff says that Russian expansion is the greatest threat to Western interest. That does the weighing for you and tells you that that's a bigger threat than like human rights violations are. And then the third issue with this is they give you this evidence from Sobek at the beginning, which says that when you go from the highest level of respect for human rights to the lowest level of respect for human rights, basically what that means is there's an increase in likelihood of, or a decrease in the likelihood of conflict. But that's implying that Russia is at the highest level of respect for human rights right now, which obviously they're not, considering how Putin has acted in Russia over the last couple of years. Moreover, it says it's going from the lowest to the highest, which is literally going from 0 to 100 right quick, and that's why you should feel comfortable affirming.
Yeah.
So, in your rebuttal, you kind of just assert that the cost is high on the EU.
Yeah, we can give you evidence on that.
How is it high enough to meet the bright line of Letskin's impact?
It's 92 billion euros, 2.2 billion.
Yeah, out of a $17 trillion economy in Europe, that's not that a lot.
So, well, it's 2.2 million jobs. So how high is the bright line on the Letskin study?
You tell me, you seem to be the expert on it.
I'm not an expert on it. Like, you're running it in case. I'm not running it in case. I just know what the conclusion says, so you should be able to like articulate it for me.
If neither of us know what the bright line is for the conclusion of that result, like how are we supposed to weigh it?
Yeah, sure. Let's not wait. Let's go.
No, how are we supposed to weigh that specific part of the study? Like I tell you,
Wait,
like,
no, you can't assert that it's like a low cost to yourself based on not knowing the
No,
bright line.
I
That's
just-
like putting me in an untenable position.
Wait,
You're saying
no.
we don't know if it's a high cost. That means inherently we don't know if it's a low cost
no,
either.
No. You're the one who's making the argument that the cost is high enough to the point where
Okay.
Europe will, where
And you're the
the
one-
sanctions will be
right.
successful. Therefore, you have the burden of showing me that the cost is actually high enough because that's your argument.
No, you have the burden of telling me that the argument you make, the evidence you use, is applicable to your side of the
No,
resolution.
you have the burden of proving that the arguments that you make in response to my case are true.
So,
You- like,
all right. So how do you prove it's a low cost?
How do I prove that it's a low cost?
Yeah.
Again, that's not my. I just proved
It's
it
your
was.
evidence.
It's
You should be able to
$92
support
billion
it.
out of a $17 trillion economy. You have to prove to me that that's significant
Well,
enough to
along
create
with
the impact.
2.2 million jobs. Can I ask you a question?
Okay, great.
You say that Russia's already strong enough to like go into Ukraine according to global fire, right?
Yeah.
Are they strong enough to fight off the West if the West backs up Ukraine?
First of all, the West didn't back up Ukraine militarily
Yes, we
last
did,
time.
with
They
sanctions.
just imposed. Oh yeah, they just imposed
Okay.
sanctions. And what happened in the wake of that was Russia just took more parts of eastern Ukraine.
How
The
much?
only-
Wait, how much more after sanctions?
They took Crimea, they took Donetsk, which
No,
is a,
that
and
was
key
all
airports.
before
No.
sanctions.
In February of 2015, they took more cities and airports in eastern Ukraine.
So how
I can
much
read
more?
you.
How much
I'll
more
show you.
land?
They took a key. Like the physical quantity of land doesn't matter so much as significance.
Okay,
They took
and
key
is
airports
fight-
and key cities.
And how many like casualties did that result in?
I don't know, but you tell me expansion is the most important impact.
Right.
So insofar as I'm
But, like,
proving
the reason
I'm
expansion-
meeting your bright line.
Okay, and so have they expanded since February?
Have they expanded since February? Well, what the Walker evidence of The Guardian tells you is even though they're not engaging in as much direct military action as much themselves, they're actually funding rebels and destabilizing Ukraine politically that way.
Okay, so how much fighting is there in Ukraine?
How much fighting is in there in Ukraine? I would say it hasn't gone down. Like,
Okay.
there's like you
According to
tell me-
whom? Like
you-
that's your analysis, but
Yeah.
according to whom?
according to like the evidence that I read you, according to essentially the fact that like in eastern Ukraine, we're still seeing Russia taking land. The only reason why
Well, back in February, right?
Right.
Not since February.
right.
Okay.
So like, what has the impact of sanctions been since February? Like,
What we tell you with the Polsharok evidence from September is that fighting is currently at its lowest level.
Right.
I'd say that
But
post
the reason why that is because Russia has gotten all that it wants out of the region. Bloomberg explains that Russia only wanted eastern Ukraine and Crimea.
But,
Once it
you're
achieves
telling me
those
they want to be
regions-
like really aggressive in the region. You just
yeah, but they're
contradict
not
yourself
taking more land. They're just using political destabilization for funding.
Right.
All right, can I get the phone?
Yeah.
We'll start there. So we have like 5 seconds left, right? Is everybody ready? Okay. Seated by Chase, the place that you're going to be voting in this round is expansion. If we prove to you that Russian aggression has gotten worse, then you're going to, it's an easy negative ballot. So let's start on this idea of nationalism that Chase discusses in rebuttal. He talks about how polls show that support for the government is at all-time lows. But that's not the point, right? What Harrison reads in rebuttal, according to Jurgens, is that Putin has been able to nationalize the elite class, who they themselves say is far more important in Putin's decision-making calculus than any other group in Russia. And that's because Putin controls the wealth that he gives to the oligarchs. They are in power because of Putin. They have been nationalized. That means that they want more aggression. As Russian economy goes down, aggression goes up. That's the Economist's response that goes completely unresponded to. And this is manifesting itself in 5 ways in the status quo. The first is Syria. He says that in Syria right now, the UN just passed a resolution, but I think that actions speak louder than words. Putin has said before that he's going to fight ISIS, but every single time he has continued to bomb anti-ISIS rebels in order to prop up Assad. But second, and more importantly, Harrison reads in rebuttal that military spending is at an all-time high. Chase says that capability is seriously important, but he doesn't meet the bright line for how Russian military spending or Russian military power decreases. He doesn't prove to you that the Russian military falls to 3rd, 4th, or 5th. I think that willingness to attack is far more than capability to attack, because Russia will always have a strong military, and Harrison says that it is never actually cut from modernization. But the third way that is manifesting is the Larissa Brown evidence that says that Russia is preparing for all-out war right now in Europe. The fourth is according to Walker of The Guardian, who says that Russia, instead of fighting actively and instead of expanding, they're actually funding political instability in Ukraine by funding Russian separatists. Even if they say that conflict is at an all-time low, that doesn't really mean anything, because according to Bloomberg News, Russia doesn't actually want more of Ukraine. That's why they're expanding to places like Syria. Fifth, and the NATO is doubling their spending and their rapid reaction forces because they have their feet put to the fire. For these reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
Can we say
Basically just
yes.
Oh, yeah. Actually, no. Yeah. That was good.
We're ready for that.
Judging feels so weird, guys. Do they have a steak? They have a steak place right by there. I don't know. Sure, that's fine. Yeah, I'll ask her. Steak or sushi? Steak. She wants steak. We can go for sushi tomorrow for lunch. Kyle.
a little bit different. I'm actually going to address all 5 things that we talked about in this summary at the very end. Respond to them, discuss them, just debate about them. And then go back to our side of the flow and talk about why we're clearly winning ground. All of you ready? You guys? Go. Judges, first he says look to Syria when he talks about how actions speak louder than words. The problem is this is putting Putin in a position where there is no precedent. This is a UN resolution before he has violated treaties. Those are completely different. We like to contend that because it is a UN resolution that is supranational, that he will not violate it. Even more so, it is so recent that there's no guarantee that he will violate it. At the best, this is a wash. Even more so, he talks about how the military spending is at an all-time high. The problem is he clean drops Chase's response from Gaddy, which talks about this spending is unsustainable, and in the long term, they will cut their military spending. Even more so, he talks about from Brown how there's an all-out war. The problem is, A, they don't have a capability for this all-out war, and even more so, if that was true, Polterack still tells you that killings are at an all-time low, conflicts at an all-time low. Our evidence post-states there's therefore you're going to be preferring it on recency. Then he talks about how they're funding Russian separatists. The problem is, if this was true, fighting would be increasing. But what Polterack tells you that fighting is decreasing. Obviously, there's no impact from funding these separatists because conflict is decreasing. Then he talks about how there's 2 times NATO spending at the very least, or at the very most, this is just the West spending money on something. Lives above money, it's a very clear weighing analysis. Now back to our side of the flow. He tries to tell you from the GFP that Russia has the 2nd largest military. The problem is they're fighting 21st century wars with Cold War weapons. What that means is they don't have the technology to accurately fight against Western nations. Even if they're the 2nd largest, it still doesn't have the strength to deter wars with the West. Then from Vice, they tell you that they're getting money from China. The problem is their very own case tells you that they're not getting any loans. That's from Bakani. You can cross-apply their own case. You're seeing they're not getting any money. Then from The Guardian, he talks about how they're going to make their own technology. The problem is he blatantly ignores what Bodner tells you, which talks about they need foreign technology and that there is no domestic analog. Putin cannot make this technology. He needs to get it from the West, and that's why we link into the concept of decreased military aggression. We do it for 2 reasons. First, from Krebs, which talks about how modern wars need large amounts of financing. They're not getting that because of sanctions. Second, from Bonner, which talks about how they need modern technology. They're also not getting that because of sanctions. Then we link into Lavrov and Polterack, who talks about there's a final ceasefire going on. Killings are at an all-time low. This goes unresponded to. Cleanest place to vote. There's a 100% probability that we're saving lives on some level. For some negligible probability, something happens in Syria, something happens in China. Thus, we affirm.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Why does the fact that it's a UN resolution make it any different from the treaty signed by?
Well, no, like the evidence you gave me wasn't talking about the treaty, it was talking about claims made by Russia.
Why does the fact that it's a UN resolution and the UN has very little enforcement power make it different?
Here's the difference, is that like there's no precedent for this. Like, right, this was the last time he multilaterally agreed with other countries and like signed something holding him to
So
that.
give me a warrant as to why he would actually be upheld to this contract.
I mean, there's a little bit more of a backfire with the violating an agreement amongst
Such
such
as what?
nations.
Putin's
How
never
has
been
that played out for the United States?
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
also
so let's look at like right
Putin's
now
never been a
sanctions
hero
are in
to the
place
UN.
because he violated an agreement that was created after the fall of the
Wait,
Soviet
Right, so if
Union.
he
Sam,
continues violating UN resolutions,
Sam,
that's
wait.
further punishments imposed on him by the
Putin's
West.
never been Putin's never been a hero for the UN. He's never always gone along with what they said.
Right.
Right.
There's a
So
difference
please
between
give me a warrant for why the fact that it's a UN resolution makes it different.
Right, and we just proved that to you, which is that there's a difference between not getting along and breaking an agreement signed with them, and that's because
Why?
after they break the agreement signed with them, the West has to take retaliatory action, which either means
But,
military force, probably
but
not, or
according
further
to you,
sanctions.
they did that anyway because they passed sanctions even before the UN resolution was in place.
No, yeah, but
How
there's-
much more?
you
How much
realize
more
there's-
enforcement or retaliation is there because of a UN resolution?
There's more sanctions, like they can.
How much more? Wait, since when? Since when is that even involved in the U.S. resolution? In the UN resolution?
Well, no, it's like a symbolic gesture because
Yeah,
when you violate one of
exactly.
the main multilateral institutions in the world, the West has no choice
No,
but to show
but the
that they
problem
can't do
is that this main multilateral force in the world has absolutely zero enforcement power.
Okay, can we ask you a question?
Sure.
So if they go into Ukraine, do you think the West just like won't react at all? Like if they continue expanding?
Okay, I said in summary, and this is something that Sam dropped that's key, that according to Bloomberg News, Russia doesn't actually want more of Ukraine. They have gotten all of their strategic interests out of the region.
Okay, so where are they being aggressive?
They're being aggressive right now in Syria. They're being aggressive in displaying the fact that they have increased their military spending, and obviously the West is feeling this as NATO is creating a rapid reaction force in response
if
to
they don't want
Russia.
any more land, why are they increasing their military spending for
Because they are
expansion?
preparing to go abroad. It's just that I'm just talking about
Wait,
Ukraine.
going abroad for what?
I'm just talking about Ukraine.
Okay, and like in order to go into Syria, he needs money too, right?
No, not actually that much.
Why
Drone
not?
strikes are a lot less costly
How
than
many drones
military
does Russia have?
occupation.
How many drones does Russia have?
I'm not sure, but we have evidence to suggest, evidence to suggest that the airstrikes that Russia is sending into Syria are a lot cheaper than full-on military
How does it make
occupation.
sense that like launching an airplane from Russia to Syria is going to be cheaper?
Because
Like,
when you have a full-on military occupation, you have to pay for the quartering of troops. You have to pay for the food of the troops. You have to pay for a lot of different costs. Whereas when you do airstrikes, you just send the airplane there with a pilot, drop the bomb, and you're done.
Yeah, the really key problem is, and it's been dropped out this entire round, that Bodner tells you that they don't have the technology to make those airplanes. They
No,
need rather
it
the
hasn't
West,
been
and that's what
dropped.
sanctions
They
come
never
off.
cut from modernization
Kyle's
efforts.
holding up his fist.
I guess I take the 5.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay. Opponents, partner, all the judges. Let's start on where they want you to vote for them on military capacity. Couple things here. First, the vice evidence postdates the evidence we read in case, so technically Russia is getting loans now. Even if that's true, that doesn't defeat the fact that Russia's economy is still being hurt. They are still getting loans. However, capital investment is at an all-time low. What that means is Russia is still able to finance wars through loans, but however, economic strength is decreasing, so we still link it to increase in the military aggression through our economist card, which literally gets dropped this entire round. The way Putin's decision-making calculus works, and thus the oligarchs' decision-making calculus, as we prove, who are dependent on Putin, is that the lower economic wealth gets in Russia, the only way Putin knows how to respond is through an increase in aggression. Here's how this is manifesting in the real world and where you can sign your ballot. The first is on Syria. They say essentially that a UN resolution is going to change everything. But when has the UN resolution ever changed anything? This is a new response they make in summary, but remember what I tell you in response to their own case, which is the United States itself has frequently violated international law. They don't prove to you Russia will meet the bright line of protecting international law. Insofar as that's true, you can extend Syria clean through the round. We show you that's a direct, most salient increase in conflict. They try to get you to vote for them off of Ukraine, but the reason why it's at an all-time low, as we read and is never responded to, is from the Bloomberg evidence that tells you that Russia has gotten most of the land it wants. It has all of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So yes, logically it would make sense that all of violence is at an all-time low, because Russia has less work to do now than they have ever had to do before. At the end of the day, we still show you through the Walker evidence that they're still continuing to fund the rebels and destabilize politically, even if that's less violence, that's still continued violence. It's just because they've met most of their goals. Finally, we show you through the Brown and Baker evidence that don't really get responded to, that NATO and Russia right now are both ramping up their military capacity and preparing for all-out war. They tell you this isn't possible. We say it is because essentially at the end of the day, they can't prove to you that Putin has less militarization. They can't even show you that he goes from second strongest military in the world to 10th largest military in the world. They say he needs modern tech, but we tell you modern tech doesn't matter in places like Syria and Ukraine, who don't have modern tech themselves. At the end of the day, these proxy wars still happen. We still see increases in conflict in Syria. We still see mobilization on both fronts. That's why you're voting for us. Thank you.
All right, we'll run some time.
Whose flow's better?
What?
Whose flow's better?
Minus.
Said whose is better. Whose is better?
All right, is everybody ready? It's going to be the same for every exam. All right, start off on the issue. Oh, wait. Okay, now let's get rid of the Start off on the issue of Syria. What we tell you is that there's been a UN resolution which is different from the claims that Putin has made in the past, because now it's a part of a multilateral agreement. At best, at the end of the round, so watch. There's two reasons you don't vote off this argument for them. The first is that the UN resolution was passed too recently for it to be evaluated fairly in the round, because we don't know what's going to happen. And secondly, they give you no impact whatsoever off of Syria. Like, they don't tell you how much conflict is increasing. They don't tell you how many lives are being lost. Consequently, there's literally no impact for you to evaluate at the end of the round. Even if you think to win the argument, there's literally no reason to vote off of it. Now let's talk about the argument of military spending. What they drop throughout the entire round is the Gaddy analysis, which tells us that even if they are increasing increasing military spending right now, it's not sustainable because they've had to cut the amount they're increasing it by substantially. That's because they can't get money from the West. The reason that's really important, though, is that it means even if there is like a short-term increase in violence, in the long term, the war is not sustainable. Consequently, they have to cut the amount of money they're spending. They can't continue it. Then they give you brown evidence saying there's going to be an all-out war. First, there's a really clear contradiction here because they say they don't want Ukraine. If they don't want Ukraine, they obviously wouldn't be funding like an all-out war. Secondly, we give you the Polterrock evidence, which postdates that evidence, which says that casualties are currently at an all-time low and fighting is at an all-time low. Then fourth, they say they're backing Russian separatists. Again, this contradicts the Bloomberg evidence. Moreover, the Polterrock evidence shows the fighting is at an all-time low. What that means at the end of the round, though, is that the separatists aren't having like a big impact. Then they tell you NATO spending is going up, lives are weight over money. That's an obvious rank analysis. We go on to our case. Basically, they say that the Russian military is already really large. The issue with that is that even if it is large, it doesn't have like the military capability or the military technology to effectively engage the West, and they need to modernize the military before that's actually possible. The Bodner evidence tells you even if they like, put a bunch of money into it, they don't have the domestic analog to the military weapons to actually produce them domestically effectively. And that's really important for two reasons. The first is the Krebs evidence, which shows that modern wars are financed through borrowing. Basically, that's important because the Gadny evidence says that they can't sustain their current military intervention going in the long term. That means they have to pull out of Syria anyways if you want to vote off that, and they also can't go into Ukraine and sustain intervention there. Secondly, the Bodner evidence tells you they need military technology. They need to import that in order to modernize the technology to make it feasible for them to go into Ukraine. Therefore, none of that can happen. The biggest impact analysis at the end is the Polterrock and Lavrov evidence, which shows that fighting is at a new low since the Ukraine conflict began. This outweighs on magnitude because it saves lives, and secondly, it outweighs on probability because you don't know if anything they're saying is going to happen, but you definitely save lives if you affirm.
Should we shake all the judges' hands?
Oh, no, it's okay. What do you got?